Hi guy, welcome back TV spoilers. Young and the Restless reveal that Jill Abbott's death hit Genoa City. Like a coin dropped on marbleno explosion, just a sharp, cold sound that made everyone understand an era had been cut short. For Billy, it wasn't only the loss of a woman who had long served as a pillar, the last voice still capable of pulling him back onto the right track. It was the collapse of an emotional brace he had been leaning on without admitting it. Lately, Billy had already been wound tight because of Chancellor and because of Kane. Because of the sense that he was closing in on an opportunity he'd chased for years, but never fully held, especially as everything around him shifted. As his relationship with Sally kept getting stress-tested by the shadow called Chancellor, and by Kane's offer that smelled like a trap. In Genoa City, you don't have to know who's right or wrong to see what's obvious. Billy was being dragged back toward an old ambition, and Sally was watching that ambition like a doorway that could swallow them both. Their disagreements didn't erupt into fireworks, they condensed into a steady, corrosive chill. Every time Billy stared at Chancellor, Sally stared at him like someone watching a man step toward a line she couldn't cross with him. That kind of tension had already been hanging in the air in their recent orbit, with Kane's connection to Chancellor forcing Billy into painful choices, and Sally increasingly questioning the motives behind every gift Kane dangled. So Jill's death didn't land in a vacuum. It dropped straight into a crack and widened it. The day the will was read, familiar faces from the Chancellor circle gathered not just to hear what went where, but to find a new foothold now that the old one was gone. Billy walked in with a confidence that felt almost instinctive. Jill was Jill. Her legacy was Chancellor. And Billy had carried both Abbott and Chancellor in his blood like a promise. He knew Genoa City specialized in cruel pivots, but he still believed the will would be one rare piece of stability after a sudden death. From the outside, that belief might have looked naive. For Billy, it was necessary. The one story he needed in order to convince himself that life still held room for order, fairness. A moment where he didn't have to gamble everything to claim what was supposed to be family. While he waited, he found himself missing Jill in the most uncomfortable way, not through soft memories, but through the feeling of being seen through, of being shoved away from his worst impulses, of being dragged back to reality. He hated that feeling because it forced him to admit, deep down, how much he'd always needed someone strong enough to stop him from himself. And now Jill wasn't there. When the will was finally read, the room didn't immediately turn loud. Shock rarely makes noise first. It creates a hollow space, as if the air has been sucked out. Billy heard each sentence fall with the sensation of a clock inside his chest, slipping off its rhythm. Control of Chancellor Industries wasn't being handed to him completely the way he believed. There was no clean, total transfer, no inheritance moment that affirmed his identity in one stroke. Instead came a cold, shared power structure tightened by conditions so strict they sounded like a suspended sentence. Authority wouldn't rest with one person, but would be locked beneath oversight and trusted to an independent board operating by rules that couldn't be bent by bloodline or emotion. Jill hadn't cut Billy out, but she hadn't crowned him without restraints either. She placed him in a cage built of legal language and handed him a key that wasn't quite real. His title might still shine, but the true door was somewhere else. What hurt Billy wasn't simply losing absolute control. It was the humiliation of realizing Jill had doubted him enough to construct a control system. Even after she was gone, he tried to defend her in his own mind, tried to tell himself this was caution. Jill protecting Chancellor from predators, from Newman pressure, from poisonous alliances. Yet the harder he tried, the more an acidic shame rose in him. The person he most wanted on his side had also become his biggest obstacle. In that moment, Billy didn't know if he was mourning Jill or mourning a faith that had died before she did. The damage spread instantly to another corner of Billy's thinking, his plan with Kane. Billy had been walking a thin wire where Kane was both a necessary, unwanted ally and a looming threat, and Chancellor was the bait that made logic slippery. Billy had believed that if he held full control, he could use Chancellor as a chessboard to hit back at Newman, to stand level with Victor instead of always reacting to Victor's moves. But the will shattered that. An independent board didn't care about Billy's ego or the multi-generational war between Abbott and Newman. They cared about procedures, conditions, standards as cold as spreadsheets and worse. They had veto power. Billy's plan with Kane, already risky, became something that could be blocked before it even left the gate, leaving Billy exposed, cornered and humiliated. Kane didn't need to look happy or sad to make the room heavier. There was a calmness to him that could drive people insane, as if he always saw the next moves while others were still reeling from the present one. Kane was already under pressure from Victor, a pressure that didn't need to be spoken to be suffocating. That pressure made Kane more practical, more willing to turn any event into leverage. The Will's revelation Billy not receiving total control was a slap to Billy's ambition, and a strategic gold mine for Kane. Kane saw what Billy hadn't even named yet. The board was a foothold, a crack someone could exploit, turning Chancellor from Billy's family ground into a system that could be manipulated by clauses, votes, standards. Kane didn't have to create chaos. He only had to learn how to ride the chaos that had arrived on its own. For Victor Newman, the news landed like a chess piece dropping neatly into the hands of the most experienced player in town. Victor didn't even need to act in that first instant. Billy losing absolute control was already enough to reshape the board in Victor's favor. Without Victor lifting a finger, Victor saw more than just a chance to squeeze Billy, he saw a chance to wedge Kane as well. If Kane was trying to secure footing inside Chancellor's structure, an independent board could be both obstacle and tool depending on who managed to influence it. And Victor, who had always known how to weaponize systems, wouldn't ignore that. Sally, standing at the edge of the storm, didn't have the luxury of being wrecked by grief. She could mourn Jill, but grief couldn't outrun her caution. In Sally's world, every event in Genoa City comes with a side effect. And this Will's side effect was simple: Billy would be pulled even harder toward Chancellor. And Abbott communications, your future would once again be thrown onto a scale. Sally didn't panic loudly, she panicked with clarity. She looked at Billy in his stunned silence and recognized the danger when Billy was wounded. He often responded by charging into battle not to win, but to prove he wasn't weak. And Chancellor, more than anything else, was the battlefield he used to prove it. Sally could already see the long nights, the tense meetings, the impulsive decisions disguised as strategy. She and Billy's allies would have to adjust not only in business, but in how they kept Billy from lighting himself on fire. Yet they also knew the cruel truth: the more they tried to hold him back, the more controlled he'd feel and the more he'd do the opposite. The days after the will, Billy entered a war he wasn't psychologically prepared for. Facing the board felt like facing a wall without a face. There was no single enemy to hate, no individual thief to name. There were only clauses, conditions, and assessing eyes that measured him by criteria. For Billy, that was the most maddening kind of opponent, because it couldn't be beaten by instinctive confrontation. He was forced to prove himself, forced to comply, forced to move to someone else's tempo. Every time he reread the will's conditions, he felt Jill's presence in it as warmth, but as posthumous supervision. He wanted to honor her and he wanted to break what she'd left. That conflict ground him down hour by hour, stole his sleep, and turned Chancellor from a company into a test of his own worth. If he couldn't take back control, did that mean he wasn't worthy? Or did it mean Jill had been right not to trust him? While Billy wrestled with that, Kane began to exploit the situation in the quiet, inevitable way he always did. He didn't lunge for a chair. He planted the idea that Billy needed him. He invoked Victor, the bigger war, the notion that the board would never back a man seen as emotional or reckless. Kane painted a picture where Billy could only reclaim power if he had a formidable counterweight beside him, Simeon cunning enough to play within the rules. Kane always knew how to make himself sound like the answer to another person's fear. And this was where the wire between Billy and Kane tightened towards something dangerous. Billy understood Kane was steering the moment. Yet he also knew that boxed in by the board and by Victor, Kane might be the quickest way to stay alive in the game. That realization disgusted Billy. He was considering leaning on someone he didn't trust, simply because he couldn't tolerate losing control. The more Billy tried to stay calm, the more a deeper insecurity leaked through. He didn't just fear losing Chancellor. He feared being seen as the heir who couldn't carry a legacy. In Genoa City, honor isn't a speech, it's the assets you hold when the storm hits. Billy had long been branded the impulsive Abbott son, the man who chased personal wars with Victor, the one who chose the hardest path just to prove he was different. Jill's will, in effect, shoved him into a framework that demanded maturity. But instead of seeing an opportunity, Billy felt insulted. That insult pushed him toward a vow to challenge the will's harsh terms. The vow sounded like pride, it smelled like desperation. If he didn't break the cage, he would suffocate inside it. Sally watched Billy drift farther away. She couldn't argue him back with words, the damage was too raw, and noise would only spark bigger destruction. But silence between them became its own private war. Sally wanted a long game, wanted Billy to resist Kane's pull, wanted him to treat the board like a puzzle solved by patience rather than explosions. Billy felt every warning, every anxious look from Sally as another vote of no confidence. He loved her, but he hated that loving her came with the condition don't do what you want. And he hated more that Sally might be right. Truth was always what made Billy react hardest because truth left him nowhere to hide. Victor didn't need to stand in front of Billy to apply pressure. In Genoa City, the mere fact that Victor knew was enough to make everyone adjust their behavior under his shadow. Billy knew Victor wouldn't let this pass. Kane knew Victor would interfere. The board knew Victor was a variable they couldn't ignore. Chancellor Industries, once a family inheritance, became a multi-layered battlefield, grief over Jill, the legal cage of the board, Kane's opportunism, and the deep, old war with Newman. Billy stood in the center, heir, pawn, and test subject all at once. The power struggle didn't begin with fists. It began with meetings where Billy felt measured like a number. Each time he pushed his will, the board pushed back with clauses. Each time he tried to accelerate, they reminded him of strict conditions. Billy started to understand the terror of a system. It doesn't need to hate you to limit you. It only needs to exist. And in that space, Kane found more room to move. Kane could play the man who understood the rules, the man with solutions, the man offering shortcuts that sounded reasonable. But Billy couldn't forget, Kane would profit if Billy failed. That suspicion turned their partnership into a rope in a tug of war. They needed each other to stand against Victor and against the board. But they were ready to stab each other the moment opportunity appeared. When Billy set his mind on challenging the will, he wasn't only challenging paperwork. He was challenging the version of himself Jill had implied. He wanted to prove she was wrong, not to trust him with full control. Yet the deeper he went, the more he faced the paradox. If he broke the will, he might seize power. But he might also destroy what Jill had tried to protect. If he complied, he could preserve the appearance of honoring Jill, but risk being pushed out of true authority. Chancellor's future turned unstable not merely because power was shared, but because the heir psyche was splitting down the middle. And Genoa City never spares people who split. It turns them into targets. The hook came as a thin, deep cut. Billy realized the board wasn't simply supervising him. They had prepared a trigger mechanism ready to suspend his executive authority if he violated the spirit of the will. And that mechanism could be activated by exactly the kind of partnership Billy had once viewed as his escape, a strategic alignment with Kane at this moment. Billy saw the trap set in advance, turn away from Kane, and he loses the one ally who might help him survive. Victor moved toward Kane, and he might hand the board a legal excuse to remove him from Chancellor. The instant he tries to reclaim it, and the moment Billy recognized the floor panel door beneath his feet, his phone lit up with an emergency summons from the board demanding he appear the next morning to confirm his collaboration direction. While Kane's name flashed on the screen like a warning that Kane already knew and was waiting for Billy to step into the square he wanted. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. Jill Abbott's death doesn't land in Genoa City as a single emotional shock. It lands like a structural fault line. Because Jill was the kind of woman who could still steer the lives of the living, even after she was gone, through conditions, hidden keys, and safeguards designed long in advance. With Matt Clark newly arrested and being held without bail while awaiting trial, the air around Nick and Sharon has already been thick with dread, because they know Matt has never been a one-note threat. He is a past that breathes, a past that returns at the exact moment you think you have finally buried it. The recent calm they've been clinging to has always felt conditional, like a thin sheet of glass over deep water, because their lives have taught them too many times that quiet in Genoa City is often just the pause before trouble changes shape. And at the very moment everyone expects the will reading to be a ritual of closure, an official ending to a chapter, Jill turns it into a lever that pries open a new one, sharper and far more merciless. The will reading at Chancellor draws everyone in with almost absolute focus, not only because corporate power makes people straighten their backs on instinct, but because Jill's name has always been synonymous with legacy, control, and the kind of planning no one dares to underestimate. Billy walks into that room carrying a conflicted heaviness, real grief, yes, but also the wary awareness that in Genoa City, loss rarely arrives as only loss. Part of him wants the will to put things back into order, at least on paper, because order is what he craves when his internal world feels unstable. Yet Jill's version of order has never been gentle. It is a kind of order with teeth, designed to force people to grow up by confronting what they would rather avoid. Just when the will seems to be moving along familiar tracks, assets, authority, conditions, on detail hits like a sudden wrong note that changes the entire melody. Jill has left behind an old document or a message attached to one that directly mentions Matt Clark. A single name is enough to bleach the room of warmth. Matt is not just a criminal in a file, he is a living scar in the collective memory of Genoa City, and especially in the private history of Nick and Sharon. Matt is tied to some of the darkest injuries in their lives, not simply because of what he did, but because of the way he made them feel powerless inside their own story. That Jill would place his name inside her final instructions cannot be random. It reads like a secret door Jill chose to unlock at the exact moment everyone was most vulnerable. The document doesn't need to recite every known crime to stun them. It only needs to touch the one gap no one has ever been able or willing to fully see. And the most frightening part is that Jill does not frame it as a straightforward accusation. She leaves it as a fragment that demands assembly, forcing those left behind to build the picture themselves. From that instant, Matt's case is no longer a simple legal line moving from arrest to verdict. If Nick and Sharon had been holding onto the fragile belief that Matt was behind bars, and justice would do the rest, they now face the possibility of something deeper and darker, something that could reframe the evidence, shift the motive, and completely reshape how the court, the city, and the people involved will interpret the truth. It doesn't merely complicate the case in a technical sense. It rips open old wounds and makes Nick and Sharon realize they never truly escaped Matt. They only learned how to live in his shadow. Nick and Sharon react in different ways, and the difference itself becomes another point of pain. Sharon is yanked back into trauma that is both physical and psychological kind of memory. She has spent years trying to transform into something she can survive without collapsing. Matt, for Sharon, isn't only a man who committed crimes. He is the embodiment of being stripped of control, of humiliation sealed inside silence, of the terrifying knowledge that the past can return and demand payment at any moment. Nick is triggered by another kind of rage, a protective fury laced with helplessness. Anger at a system that once allowed lies and manipulation to poison everything. Anger at the idea of Sharon being dragged through this again. And because Nick's love often expresses itself as refusal to surrender. This new revelation doesn't calm him, it hardens him, turns his determination into something almost combustible. The problem is that Jill's document doesn't offer a straight path to justice. It offers a maze. Billy is pulled into the storm in the cruelest way, because he never wanted to become the person carrying yet another investigation. While the grief is still raw, but by tying Matt to something that functions like an explosive trigger, Jill has placed Billy into a role he didn't ask for, the reluctant conduit, who must help bring the truth into the open, not only to protect Chancellor from fallout, but to keep Nick and Sharon from being caught in a new trap. The hardest part for Billy isn't the action, it's the meaning. He begins to understand that Jill didn't simply leave him a company or a legacy. She left him a test. It feels like she chose him deliberately as a bridge between family, business, and just to see as if she believed he could carry responsibility, but also as if she wanted to challenge him one final time. Billy has always lived inside a conflict between his hunger to be recognized as capable and his fear that he will fail at the one moment that matters most. Jill's move doesn't allow him to stand outside the darkness. It forces him to walk into it. The deeper Billy digs into what Jill left, the clearer it becomes that she didn't merely mention Matt. She pointed toward a hidden connection between Matt and Genoa City that no one has fully known, or no one has dared to name. And that for no one knew creates a special kind of fear. Because if there was an old line, an old compromise, a long-buried mistake by someone powerful that once helped Matt survive, helped him change shapes, helped him return when he should have been erased, then this truth won't belong to one person. In Genoa City, secrets don't stay contained. They spread like ink, staining anyone who ever touched the same page. Victor Newman's anger erupts the moment he senses this secret could interfere with the trajectory of his own plans against Matt. For Victor, revenge and control are two sides of the same instinct, and a revelation that changes the legal landscape means the game is no longer moving to his schedule. It isn't that Victor hates truth, he hates truth that arrives from a place he doesn't command. That is Victor's particular brand of fury at being denied the role of director. And when Victor is angry, the city feels it as a cold shift in weather, because he rarely accepts being forced into watching from the sidelines. Meanwhile, Nick and Sharon feel their fragile happiness placed directly in the crosshairs. Their happiness is not a loud celebration, it is a small, hard-won steadiness kind that looks like a quiet dinner, a night without nightmares, a morning where no one is bracing for bad news. Matt's name alone is enough to make that steadiness wobble. Jill's document makes it worse by reminding them that even if Matt is behind bars, he can still reach them through things that live outside prison walls: evidence, testimony, hidden connections, buried history. The new trouble that begins to grow isn't only about whether the case changes. It's about whether Nick and Sharon can face Matt again without losing pieces of themselves. Because confronting the person who once shattered you is always a form of re-traumatization. And people rarely walk through it without paying some price, if not in public, then in the private, silent places where fear lives. As Billy moves forward, he begins to feel that Jill has placed an emotional inheritance on his shoulders, not just a financial one. He can't stop asking questions that cut like glass. Why did Jill keep this document until the end? Why not speak sooner? Was she protecting someone? Or was she forcing someone into a corner where denial becomes impossible? And the hardest question of all, did she trust Billy to do the right thing? Or was she punishing him by making him carry something heavy enough that he can't run from it? Billy, in this state, stops being a man thinking only of strategy or power. He becomes a son trying to decode his mother's last message. He fears that if he chooses wrong, he won't just damage a case, he'll betray Jill's meaning. But he also fears that if he chooses right, he will be forced to look directly at truths that will make it harder to believe in people. As Jill's clues begin to pull the truth about Matt Clark into the light, relationships across Genoa City start to shift permanently. Because once a secret is lifted, no one can pretend the past is dead. Nick and Sharon will begin to look at the people around them with a different kind of vision. Not simply trust versus distrust, but a sharper question: who knew what, who stayed silent, who benefited? Billy will look at himself differently, because he will understand that legacy isn't something you simply inherit. It is something that tests you. Victor will adjust, because a new variable has entered the board from outside his control. And Genoa City, as always, will continue obeying its own law. The vulnerable get crushed. The powerful get a chance to become even more ruthless. There is a complicated feeling that comes with watching a story like this unfold. It is gripping, but it is also exhausting in a way that feels personal. As if the audience is being pulled by the throat toward a darkness they recognize too well. I can't deny how effective it is. Jill speaks one last time through a document that names Matt, thickening the story and forcing every character into the kind of confrontation that creates real drama. But it also hurts, because Nick and Sharon have earned a kind of peace. And the cruelty of this twist is that it threatens to steal peace from them again. And Billy, who has spent so long trying to prove he is strong, has now been placed inside a test, where strength isn't measured by winning or losing, but by whether he can walk through the darkness Jill left behind, and still protect the human part of himself. If there's one reason I want to keep watching, it's this unsettling suspicion that the secret isn't only meant to destroy Matt. It's meant to expose an old crack in Genoa City itself, and once that crack is visible, it won't close just because a court case ends. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and discussing plot points in the Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about the Young and the Restless series.